The jacket still held the shape of his shoulders. Helen took it off the hanger, laid it on the bed, and ran her hand down the sleeve, smoothing it out. The sleeve bunched up again, as if an arm were still inside it. She turned the pockets inside out. A toffee wrapper, a spare fuse in a bit of cellophane, a Halford's receipt for 20-odd quid, and the lock-up key on a ring bound with a scrap of blue electrical tape. She arranged all of this in a neat row on the windowsill, the way a craftsman lays out tools before work, and sat down next to the jacket. 6 weeks had passed, and people had stopped coming round. For the first week, the flat had been packed. Neighbours, the lads from the ambulance station, her aunt's family from out of town, they had all brought carrier bags full of groceries. Someone brought a heavy casserole. Someone else brought a large box of Cadbury chocolates that was still sitting unopened. Then it all stopped at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. All that was left was the third-floor flat, with no lift, his old bookcase with glass doors where the Haynes car manuals stood, and the landline phone, which now stayed silent for days on end. Arthur had spent 20 years driving emergency ambulances. He started on the old Ford Transits, where the doors would freeze shut in winter and had to be kicked open. Then he moved on to the Mercedes Sprinters, and finally the new ones with the tail lifts. In all those years, he hadn't had a single accident, not one disciplinary hearing, barely even a speeding ticket. He used to collect the rare ones he got and show them to her with a smirk. Look, they caught me. But he was killed on the A-road bypass, on an empty, straight stretch of tarmac where there wasn't even anyone to overtake. A head-on collision. The cab was crushed so badly it took them a long time to cut him out. The case was closed within a month. A young police constable with ginger stubble rattled off the official phrasing to her. Failure to maintain control of the vehicle, road surface conditions, fatigue after a long shift, a possible medical episode. She tried to argue about his health. Arthur passed his occupational health medicals without a hitch. His blood pressure was like a teenager's. The constable nodded, scribbled something, and then said, looking past her out the window, "Mrs. Gower, I'll explain this to you plainly. We had 22 similar fatalities last month. There are no witnesses. No oncoming vehicle was identified, and the forensics give us nothing. You'll only make it harder on yourself if you keep coming down here every week." She stopped going down there every week. In fact, she stopped going out at all, except to the corner shop and back. And then a letter with a red warning banner dropped through the letterbox, a final demand for the council tax and the gas bill, 3 months in arrears plus late fees. It became clear she couldn't sit at home anymore. There was nothing to count on. Arthur's wages had stopped immediately, and her own had been gone for 10 years. She had left the hospital when her mother-in-law became bedridden. 3 years of it bed sores, turning her every 2 hours, bedpans, catheters, getting up in the middle of the night. Then her mother-in-law passed away, but Helen never went back to the ward. She did odd jobs for cash, giving flu jabs to the elderly neighbours, sorting out a bloke in flat 36 after a massive bender, rubbing deep heat into old missus. Higgins back on the ground floor for a tenner. Her nursing degree lay in the cupboard under a pile of bedsheets. Her NMC registration had quietly expired years ago. Terry from the second block bought the lock-up garage. He came round, paced inside it, clicked his tongue, and rapped his knuckles on the workbench. "Look, Helen, think about it. Who needs this now? The estate's going to the dogs, the streetlights are out half the time, and the roof on the 3rd row is leaking. I'm only taking it because I knew Arthur, and I've got the keys to the one next door anyway. Terry, the workbench alone is worth more than that." "It's a good bench," he agreed, turning toward the shelving. "Tell you what, I'll throw in an extra 50 quid, but cash up front, no installments. Things are tight for me right now too." She let it go for half its value and didn't haggle. For a fortnight after that, she couldn't bring herself to walk past the garages and took a massive detour through the children's playground. Tara called her herself. They used to work together. Tara had been a basic healthcare assistant back then, but now she was the ward sister on a surgical ward, and she spoke as if she were barking orders even when discussing the weather. "Helen, listen to me, and don't interrupt. Will you come on as a domestic? A cleaner? Stop wincing. I can feel you wincing down the phone. We've got 2 vacant bands on the ward. The girls have run off. We're severely short-staffed. Your nursing pin is expired. You can re-register later, do a return-to-practice course. I'll push you through it myself. But right now, excuse my bluntness, you need actual money hitting your bank account every month, not reminiscing about what you used to be. Tara, I spent 20 years finding veins. I never missed once. And you want to hand me a bucket? I'm not handing you a bucket. I'm handing you a job," Tara said flatly. "Take the night shifts. There's an unsocial hours enhancement. Plus, it'll take your mind off things. Otherwise, you'll eat yourself alive in that flat. I know your type. The NHS hospital was on the edge of town. 4 massive brick buildings behind a security fence. Between them ran tarmac paths and tall sycamore trees planted when the place first opened. From the bus stop, it was a 10-minute walk across a patch of overgrown wasteland where people were always walking their dogs and broken glass crunched underfoot. Helen went in for her first night shift, and the whole way from the main gate to the ward, she mentally rehearsed the routine as if she were going in for a clinical exam, not to mop floors. The general medical ward took up the first floor. It smelled of bleach on top of bleach, burnt porridge from the catering trolleys, and beneath it all, that distinct institutional hospital scent she would have recognized blindfolded. The housekeeper handed her a tunic a size too big, 2 pairs of latex gloves, and showed her the supply cupboard. 2 buckets with faded numbers on the side, a mop, a jerry can of concentrate, and a measuring cap on a piece of string. "Don't lose the cap," she warned. "If you mix it by eye and get it wrong, you'll be filling out an incident report." And we mop from the furthest bay toward the nurse's station, not the other way around, so you aren't walking over the wet floor. The work turned out to be simple and endless. Floors in the corridor, floors in the bays, the toilets, wiping down door handles, taking out the clinical waste bags, changing the draw sheet for a bedridden patient in Bay 6, fetching a commode, helping to roll a patient, cleaning up after someone who didn't make it to the toilet in time. Her back started aching by midnight. A hot knot formed between her shoulder blades. She would straighten up, press her fists into her lower back, stand like that for a few seconds, and grab the mop again. Old Albert lay in Bay 6, 84 years old, recovering from his second stroke. He hardly ever slept, and whenever she came in with the bucket, he would turn his head and watch her. "Valerie," he said on the very first night. "Val, close the window, there's a draft." Helen closed the window and adjusted the blanket over his chest. "I'm not Valerie, I'm Helen. I work here." "Valerie," he repeated stubbornly, chewing on his lips. "Val, put a cardigan on. You're always walking around in the cold, and then you cough all winter." "I told you, I kept telling you," a staff nurse, passing by, said quietly. "Don't argue with him. That was his wife's name. She died last year. He talks about her every night." Toward morning, the ward truly settled into silence. In those hours, you could hear the fluorescent lights humming and a tap dripping at the end of the corridor, which they had promised to fix long before she started. Helen finished mopping the final stretch, wrung out the mop, and watched the water in the bucket turn murky, and for some reason, that was the only thing all night that brought her any calm. She handed over at the nurse's station, signed the logbook, took off her tunic, and put it in a carrier bag. It was only when she stepped outside into the fresh air, and the first chill reached the damp sweat on her spine, that she felt how much her legs were throbbing from her ankles to her thighs. The security desk at the entrance was manned by Simon Fletcher, 72, lean, tall, with short hair and the straight back typical of men who had spent their whole lives sitting at a desk dealing with paperwork and had been trained never to slouch. On the desk by the turnstile lay the visitor logbook, a mug holding pens, a glasses case, and a folded-up copy of the Daily Telegraph, which he was working through, solving the crossword slowly, a few squares at a time with a biro. "New girl," he said when they first met, not looking up from the crossword. "Give me your surname, I'll put you in the book, and don't forget your ID badge." We had one wandering around for 2 months without a badge, and when the CQC inspectors turned up, everyone caught hell for it. "Gower, Gower," he repeated, writing it down. Then he lifted his head, looked at her over his glasses for a moment longer than necessary, and put the pen back in the mug. "How are you getting home, love? The bus? You walking across the wasteland?" It wasn't a question. He stood up, took his high-vis jacket off a hook, and folded the newspaper. "Come on, I'll walk you. I need to stretch my legs anyway. I sit here like a statue all night. By morning I can barely hobble to the gents." She tried to decline. She said she was a grown woman, that it was only a 10-minute walk, that she didn't want to be a bother. Simon listened without interrupting, and then walked alongside her as if she hadn't said a word. He walked her to the bus stop, stood off to the side with his hands behind his back, and waited until the bus arrived. When she got on, he raised his hand, not a wave, just a brief acknowledgement, and turned back toward the hospital gates. This repeated on her second shift, her third, and then every single one after that. For the first week, Helen found it irritating. She felt like she was being pitied, and ever since the funeral, pity was the thing she feared most. It made her insides clench and filled her with a sense of shame. By the 4th or 5th time, she couldn't hold it in. "Simon, Seriously, you don't need to do this. Nobody's going to eat me out here. They won't eat you, he agreed calmly. I spent 30 years in Sid, love. Do you know how many times I heard relatives say, but it was a busy area, but it was broad daylight. Every second time. Don't think I'm trying to scare you. It's just a professional habit, a bad one, and I'm too old to shake it. After that, she stopped arguing. More than that, she started catching herself checking the clock as she mopped the final corridor, calculating whether he would be ready to leave with her or if handover would delay her. They talked about trivial things on the way. He told her his wife had been gone for 4 years, that his son lived down south in Surrey and kept asking him to move in, but he wouldn't go because he'd just be sitting by a window staring at unfamiliar pine trees, whereas here at least he had his logbooks to fill. He told her he had learned to make a cracking beef stew, and that his stew was actually better than his wife's ever was, though he never would have admitted that while she was alive. He mentioned he bought puzzle magazines in bulk from the newsagent by the stop, and that every year they seemed to ask more questions about celebrities he'd never heard of. At first, Helen kept quiet, but then it just slipped out. They were walking across the wasteland, the frost crunching under their boots, and she said, staring straight ahead, "My husband was killed in a crash 6 months ago. He was an ambulance driver. Emergency response." Simon didn't stop, didn't gasp, didn't offer hollow condolences. He just slowed his pace exactly enough so she could comfortably walk beside him. "Tell me if you want to. If you don't, don't. There's nothing to tell. The A-road bypass, head on. The police closed the file in a month. Put it down as a loss of control." She smiled bitterly out of the corner of her mouth. He drove for 20 years, never even scraped a bumper. His hands rested on that steering wheel like a concert pianist. The old man stayed silent for about 10 paces. "And before that, was there anything?" he asked finally. "Not crashes, I mean. At home. Did you notice anything off about him?" Helen didn't answer immediately. She remembered his last few weeks, how Arthur had stopped sleeping, getting up in the middle of the night to sit in the kitchen with only the cooker hood light on. How she would wake up to find an A4-lined pad on the table, covered in his handwriting, columns of numbers and strange abbreviations, with little slips of paper like petrol receipts folded next to it. How he once brought a blue USB flash drive home from work and slipped it into his jacket pocket, rather than tossing it into the bowl with his keys like he usually did. "He was writing things down," she said. "At night. It was just a normal line notepad. I asked him what he was writing, but he'd just brushed me off. Only once did he answer. When I figure it out, I'll tell you. I was so angry at him then, like an idiot. I thought he was having an affair with someone at the station." Simon nodded. He didn't ask anything else. Not where the notebook was, what the numbers meant, or where the flash drive had gone. They reached the bus stop. He stood to the side, hands behind his back, as always. The bus pulled up, the doors hissing open. The driver shouted something about needing exact change. "Go on," Simon said. "Don't let your back get cold. Your tunic is damp with sweat under your coat. I can see it." She sat by the window. The old man stayed in the same spot until the bus pulled away, watching her leave as if he were counting the number of people who boarded after her. He noticed the silver Ford Mondeo estate on a Wednesday. The car was parked by the commercial bins behind the electrical substation, a spot nobody ever parked in because it stank in the summer and froze into deep ruts in the winter, meaning you had to rock your car to get out. Simon made a mental note of it without thinking much, just the way one notices a crooked picture frame. The estate car was facing the main gates. The engine was running, a steady stream of white exhaust plumed upward. It was rising vertically, not blowing away, which meant it had been parked there a while and the engine was warm. The man behind the wheel sat with his elbow resting on the steering wheel, staring at the gates. On Thursday, the Mondeo was in the exact same spot. On Friday, Simon stepped out from behind his turnstile at 7:30, before the medical wards had finished their shift changes, and stood by the glass double doors, picking at the peeling paint on the windowsill with his thumbnail. The man in the car wasn't smoking, wasn't on his phone, wasn't scrolling through anything. He was just sitting. But when the first group walked out of the building, 3 cleaners and a lab tech, he tensed up and raised his phone. Then he lowered it. He raised it again a minute later when Helen walked out. The old man went back to his desk, sat down, put his glasses on, and pulled the crossword toward him. The squares blurred before his eyes. He took his glasses off, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and thought, "Well, you've made it to 70, too, and your fingers are still going cold, just like they did in your first year on the force." From then on, he did what he had done his entire life, only slower, because there was no need to rush, and he couldn't afford a single mistake. First, he tested his theory. On Monday, he asked Helen to stay behind for 10 minutes, inventing a story about her needing to sign a new health and safety register that didn't exist, making her physically sign a blank piece of paper while muttering about CQC inspections. The Mondeo waited the extra 10 minutes and didn't leave. On Tuesday, he took her out through the service yard at the back of the building and walked her to the bus stop via a roundabout route past the boiler house. The Mondeo pulled away 30 seconds later, circled the perimeter wall down the road, and parked at the junction where the wasteland was fully visible. On Wednesday, Simon wrote down the registration plate. Not in his phone, but on the back of his electricity bill, which he'd been carrying in his breast pocket for a week, meaning to pay it at the post office. He wrote it in block capitals, then added next to it, Mondeo, silver, right headlight cloudy. Sticker peeled off rear window, glue residue, and the date. His handwriting was small, even, and practiced the way police write in logbooks when they know someone else will have to read it in court. On Thursday, he filmed it on his phone. His phone was an old Nokia brick. He had long ago gotten rid of the basic smartphone his son had bought him. Its camera was really only good for taking pictures of the gas meter. Simon walked out with a bucket he'd borrowed from a cleaner, setting it by the porch as if he were about to mop the steps, and filmed the car as a whole to catch the plates. Then, stepping closer, holding the phone low by his thigh, he caught the face through the windscreen. The man noticed the movement, turned away, and pulled his collar up, but his face was captured on the recording. That evening, the old man put on his raincoat, took his walking stick, which he rarely used, and took the bus across town to see Mick Evans. Mick had served with him for 22 years, took early retirement due to a bad heart, and now lived in a terraced house, breeding racing pigeons and complaining about absolutely everything. Mick listened without interrupting, staring at the registration number on the electricity bill. "Simon, you do realize I'm not the DVLA, right? Nobody owes me any favors anymore. The only old face left down at the station is young Bobby Dawson, and he barely remembers me." "He remembers," Simon said. "I went to his dad's funeral. Mick, I don't need an address. I just need a name and a place of work. I'll handle the rest." Mick went into the hallway, spoke to someone in hushed tones on the phone for a long time, and came back with a slip of paper. Victor Price, 53 years old, cars registered to him, clean record, no convictions, no arrests. He worked. Mick dragged his finger across the paper, at the Regional Ambulance Trust, as a dispatcher, resigned of his own accord late last autumn. Simon folded the paper into quarters and slipped it into his inside pocket. "Late last autumn," he repeated. "What's wrong with late last autumn?" "Nothing," the old man said. "Your pigeons are looking well. They used to be smaller." He rode the half-empty bus back home, and the entire journey he didn't think about Price, but about how he was going to tell her. He knew from experience that you couldn't let things like this fester. The longer you keep quiet, the more terrifying it sounds when you finally speak. But he also knew she had buried her husband 6 months ago, that she had dark circles under her eyes that didn't fade even on her days off, and that with one conversation, he was about to completely shatter the fragile piece she had so painstakingly cobbled together. He spent 2 more days verifying it. He took the bus to her estate one morning and stood opposite her block of flats, leaning against a postbox reading a newspaper just like a cliché from a bad spy film, which made him chuckle at himself. The Mondeo wasn't parked outside, but there was an old woman sitting on a bench, the sort who sits out in any weather. Simon sat next to her and struck up a conversation about how everyone installs UPVC double glazing these days, and how the old wooden frames they made in the old days were much better. 20 minutes later, the conversation naturally drifted to the cars parked in the estate. "They park wherever they please," the old woman eagerly complained. "Anyone can drive through here." Last autumn, there was one that practically moved in. Big silver thing, long in the back like an estate. Sat there for 3 days, then a week, then vanished. I told my husband, and he told me I had too much time on my hands. Don't suppose you remember when it vanished? Well, right around the time poor Arthur Gower was killed in that crash. That's when it stopped showing up, the old woman said matter-of-factly. The whole estate was talking about it. Good bloke he was. Used to check my blood pressure for me when I felt faint. Simon sat there a little longer, chatting about blood pressure and how expensive prescriptions were these days, and then walked to the bus stop. His legs felt heavier than usual. He chose Friday morning. Not because anything had changed, but because dragging it out any longer felt like a betrayal. Helen had a brutal shift. They brought in 2 admissions in the middle of the night. A patient in Bay 3 was crying out for hours. Albert's blood pressure spiked, and they had to bleep the on-call doctor. Helen finished handover 20 minutes late, stepping out onto the porch, pulling her woolly hat down as she walked. The first thing she noticed was that the air smelled faintly of spring, even though there was still frost on the ground, and that it felt wrong to find it pleasant. Simon was waiting by the gates, already wearing his coat. They walked across the wasteland. He stayed silent longer than usual, to the point she asked if he was feeling ill. He said he wasn't. The bus was approaching the stop. They were only about 20 paces away. Helen quickened her step, reaching into her pocket for her loose change, and practically walked into his back. Simon had stepped forward, blocking the path entirely, not aggressively. He just positioned himself sideways in front of her, and without touching her, signaled for her to stop. "Love," he said quietly, "you can't get on that bus today. You'll understand why in a minute." She froze. The bus pulled in. The driver opened the doors, looked at them, and shouted, "You getting on or what?" "No." Simon waved him off with his free hand. "Drive on." The doors hissed shut. The bus pulled away from the curb, spraying them with grey slush from the tires. "Simon, what are you doing?" Helen stared at him, bewildered. "I've got my other job to get to. I'm due at Mrs. Higgins at midday to sort her out. Mrs. Higgins will have to wait." He took her by the elbow and guided her toward a bench near the newsagent's where he bought his puzzles. The bench was covered in frost. He swept it clear with 2 strokes of his gloved hand. "Sit down. Not to rest, but because you shouldn't hear this standing up." She sat. He took out his phone, spent a long time jabbing at the screen with stiff fingers, then turned it toward her. The video showed the hospital gates in the morning light, the silver Mondeo by the bins. The footage was shaky and grainy, but the face through the windscreen was clear enough, heavy, aging, with a chin buried in a coat collar. Then the camera angle shifted, showing the man raising a phone in front of him. In that exact second, in the corner of the frame, a woman in a dark coat carrying a plastic bag walked out of the hospital doors. She recognized the carrier bag before she recognized herself. "That's me," Helen said. "That's you," Simon confirmed. He took the phone back, scrubbed forward, and handed it back. "Here's Tuesday. I took you out the back way through the service yard, remember? Look, he drives off. And here he is parking at the junction. Love, he's not waiting for you on the off chance. He knows your routine by heart. He knows you walk across the wasteland and get the bus from this stop. He knows exactly what time you finish. And when you were late today, he didn't leave. He waited." Helen's mouth went dry and tasted bitter, like waking up from a general anesthetic. "Maybe he's not here for me? There are 4 buildings, hundreds of staff. Maybe." Simon nodded, seriously, without an ounce of condescension, which somehow made it infinitely worse. "I thought that too. For the first 2 days I was second-guessing myself. 8 days. 8. I didn't tell you sooner because I didn't want to panic you over nothing." He reached into his inside pocket, pulled out the folded slip of paper, and opened it on his knee. "Victor Price. Does that name mean anything to you?" She shook her head, then stopped. "Price. Vic Price. Arthur mentioned a Price once. He was on the radios down at the ambulance station. A dispatcher." "Dispatcher," Simon repeated, resigned of his own accord late last autumn. "When was your husband killed?" Helen didn't answer. She stared at the space on the bench between them, at the dark, wet patch where the old man had brushed away the frost. He continued, his voice steady, applying no pressure, as if reading off a checklist. "I went to your estate yesterday. Got talking to a woman by the first block, grey hair, blue padded coat. She said, last autumn, a big silver estate car parked in the estate for a month, and it vanished the exact same day your husband had his crash. A woman walked past pulling a shopping trolley. The wheels clattered over the ice. Somewhere behind the newsagents, a car engine turned over, and Helen flinched. Easy, easy, Simon said. It's not him. He leaves at 8:15. I've timed him. Listen to me, love. Are you listening? I'm not trying to frighten you now. I just need to ask. That notepad you mentioned. Where is it? At home, Helen said. Her voice sounded foreign to her. Up in the loft. I put everything up there. I haven't opened it since November. We're going. Where? To yours, he said, standing up. Not on the bus, we'll get a minicab. I'm paying, so don't argue. And I won't come into the flat. If you don't want me to, I'll wait on the landing. But in the state you're in, I am not letting you climb up into a loft alone. The flat was freezing. She always turned the radiators off before her shifts. Simon came inside after all, took off his shoes, placed them neatly pointing toward the door, and stayed standing in the hallway, refusing to go any further. Helen fetched a step stool. She climbed up, pushed aside the loft hatch, and a shower of dust and the smell of old cardboard rained down on her. She pulled things down one by one. A shoebox, a rolled-up tent, an empty fishing rod holdall. She registered that automatically. A canvas tool bag, and then an old Twinings tea box, wrapped tightly in parcel tape. Back in November, she had stuffed everything from his jacket, his bedside table, and his desk into it because she couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't throw it away either. She placed the box on the kitchen table and sliced through the tape with a knife. The notepad lay on top, a standard A4-lined pad, dog-eared at the corner. Helen opened it and angled it toward the window light. The pages had columns drawn by hand. The first column was dates. The second had numbers that looked like vehicle fleet logs. Then numbers. Fuel used, mileage, litres, more litres, and in the right-hand margin, written in red pen, the difference. And almost everywhere, the difference was completely off. Further in, there were pages with nothing to do with petrol. The names of medications, drugs she knew inside out because she had spent 20 years drawing them up into syringes. Next to each one was a batch number, a date, and margin notes. 2 boxes. Grey. Doesn't match. Batch 04 label misaligned compared to April stock. Tucked between the pages were folded bits of paper. Petrol station receipts. A photocopy of an NHS supply manifest with an unfamiliar signature, and a photograph printed on cheap A4 paper. An open medical kit. Ampoules sitting in their slots, and held up in the foreground, 2 ampoules side by side. On one, the label was perfectly straight. On the other, it was slightly crooked, the text kerned too tightly. Helen placed her palm flat on the page and left it there. He was staying up all night, she said. I thought. She didn't finish. Simon walked over, asked for permission with a glance, and picked up the notepad delicately by the edges with 2 fingers, the way you hold something you're afraid of contaminating. He flicked through it in silence for a long time. Then he took off his glasses, laid them on the table, and rubbed his eyes with the heel of his hand. What? Helen asked. 30 years ago, he said, I ran a murder investigation where they killed a bloke over a file thinner than this. He took a deep breath and put his glasses back on. Love, I'm going to give it to you straight, and you need to hold your nerve. Your husband didn't lose control of his vehicle. Your husband found something, put the pieces together, and by the looks of it, was on his way to hand it over to someone, and somebody found out before he got there. Helen was silent. She stared at his fingers resting on the notepad cover, at his short, clean nails, the liver spots on the back of his hand. There was a flash drive too, she said finally. He brought it home from work and hid it in his jacket. The police gave his jacket back to me from the morgue. She looked out into the hallway, where beneath Simon's old Mac hung that very NHS ambulance fleece she had held just that morning. I didn't throw it away. Simon slowly turned his head. Did you check the pockets? I checked. This morning. A toffee wrapper, a fuse, a receipt, a lock-up key. The internal pocket, the one with the zip on the left breast. He raised his hand and tapped his own chest. These uniform fleeces always have one. Hard to feel if you don't know it's there. It's double-lined. Helen went into the hallway. She took the fleece off the peg, laid it on the table, folded back the lapel, and found a short zip, barely a few inches long, stitched flush into the seam. The zipper pull was stiff. Inside, wrapped in a folded bit of till receipt, lay a blue USB flash drive. The logo was rubbed off, the cap was missing. She held it in the palm of her hand, completely baffled as to why she hadn't checked that pocket in 6 months. Then she realized, because she always zipped the jacket up on the hanger, hung it by the loop, never touched it, and sidled past it in the narrow hallway. Right, Simon said. He sat down heavily on a kitchen chair, showing for the first time since they met that he was 72. Listen carefully and do exactly as I say. We are not plugging that into your laptop. Today, you and I are taking a taxi to a mate of mine. He'll make a copy of this onto 2 secure drives while we watch. I'm not letting you touch that notepad again with your bare hands. We'll bag it. And tomorrow morning, love, we are going down the station to make a statement. They closed it, Helen said. The police closed the file. They told me I'd only make things worse for myself. They used to tell me that too, the old man replied. About 20 times in my career. He looked at her over his glasses, and in that look, there was no pity, no comfort, just something highly practical, profoundly professional. And she suddenly leaned on that look, the way you lean your weight onto a handrail. Here's what you do. Go wash your face. I'll jot down what we need to take with us. We need a list. You can't go into places like that without a bulletproof list. The detective inspector's name was Robert Dawson, 34 years old. His office was on the 3rd floor of the station, the window facing the blank brick wall of the building next door. He listened to them all the way through without interrupting once. And that was the worst part, because detectives interrupt when they're trying to pick holes in a story, and he wasn't picking at anything. "Mrs. Gower," Dawson said when Simon placed the bag notebook on the desk, "I understand all this, but let's look at the facts. The file on your husband's fatal collision is closed. The coroner's verdict is signed off. To reopen a road traffic fatality, I need compelling new evidence, not a notepad." "It's not just a notepad," Simon said. "It's a draft of an internal audit that a man conducted entirely on his own because the trust was actively covering it up." "It's a lined pad," Dawson said gently. "No signatures, no official NHS stamps, no headers. I can't take this to the superintendent and demand we launch a murder inquiry." "How about this then?" The old man placed a second, smaller evidence bag on the desk containing the USB drive and the printed photographs, followed by his council tax bill, covered in tiny handwriting. 8 days of surveillance. Dates, times, registration plates, physical descriptions, an individual conducting hostile reconnaissance on the widow of the deceased. That same individual was employed as a dispatcher at the ambulance trust 6 months ago and resigned suddenly 2 weeks after the crash. That same individual, according to local residents, spent a month staking out her flat before the crash. Dawson pulled the council tax bill toward him, angled it to the light, and started reading. He read for a long time, then looked up. "What did you say you did?" "CID, 31 years. Detective Chief Inspector for the last 9. Simon delivered the information flatly, like he was giving his shoe size. "Look, boss, I didn't come here to teach you your job. I came here to make sure this doesn't get buried in a filing cabinet." The inspector stood up, paced to the window, and came back. "Right," he said. "I'll give it to you straight so we have no illusions. I make no promises regarding the RTC. The vehicle was scrapped months ago. The forensic collision report is filed. But the stolen drugs and fuel, that's not my department. That goes to the Serious Economic Crime Unit. I'll send it over with a cover memo, and I'll ring them myself. But Mrs. Gower," he turned to Helen, "from this moment on, you say nothing. Not to your colleagues, not to your family, not to your neighbors, especially at the hospital. Tell me nobody there knows you're here today. Only one woman knows I went to see you at all. Keep it that way." What followed were weeks that Helen would later remember as a long, windowless corridor. She went to her night shifts, mopped the floors, adjusted Albert's blankets, and listened to him call out for Valerie. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would stop in the middle of the corridor with her mop and just stare into the dark window glass, looking at her own reflection and the fluorescent light behind her. The silver Mondeo vanished from the hospital bins on the 3rd day after they gave their statements. Simon noted this without triumph. "It means someone tipped him off," he explained. "It means someone high up has started to twitch." Chloe was the first to break. She approached Helen right in the hospital courtyard by the sycamore trees. She was young, about 30, wearing a short jacket over her green paramedic uniform, holding 2 carrier bags from Tesco in one hand. "You're Helen Gower, Arthur's wife?" She placed the bags on the frosty ground and wiped her palms on her jacket. "I'm Chloe. I crewed with him. Paramedic. For the last year." They sat on a bench near the outpatient's clinic where hardly anyone walked past. Chloe spoke quickly, staring at her hands. "I kept debating whether to come or not. Debated it for 6 months. I've got 2 kids. My eldest is 8, the youngest is 4. I'm a single mum. If I lose my HCPC pin and get sacked, I'm finished. Arthur told me himself, 'Chloe, leave it. I'll deal with it.'" She fell silent. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you something, and you do what you want with it. Deal? Go on. Male patient, 71. Massive heart attack. Last October. We arrive on scene. Standard protocol. I push the thrombolysis drugs. And nothing. Absolutely nothing. Do you understand? Medically, that doesn't happen. It wasn't just that it didn't work. It was like I'd just pushed sterile water into his veins. He died in the back of the ambulance. I didn't sleep for 2 weeks. I thought I'd completely botched it, calculated the dose wrong, pushed it too fast. But Arthur said to me that night, 'Put the empty vial in your pocket and don't give it to anyone.' He took it off me, and then he took 2 others later. He'd make up excuses to scrounge them off other crews." Helen stared at her in silence. "He was obsessing over those ampoules," Chloe said, "comparing them. He kept them in the glove box wrapped in a rag. And he was always going into the dispatcher's office to have blazing rows with Vic Price about the fleet logs, shouting that his fuel usage was being recorded wrong. Everything goes through those logs. I used to think, Arthur, why are you kicking off over diesel? She started crying ugly, quiet tears, wiping her face with her sleeve. At first, Helen didn't know what to do, but then she took her by the wrist and just held her. Will you go to the police? Helen asked. I'll go, Chloe said, but only if you come with me, all right? If I go alone, I'll turn around at the front doors. By late March, the case was built not quickly or elegantly, but the way a bricklayer builds a wall, block by block, with delays and rework. The scheme turned out to be incredibly simple. They always are, once you look at them from the end backwards. Fuel was written off at inflated rates. Phantom mileage was logged on the system. Winter fuel consumption multipliers were applied all year round, and the surplus diesel and petrol was siphoned off and sold. Some of it was fenced through an independent petrol station out on the A road. Some was just sold out the back of vans. Victor Price handled all of that, because every 999 call and every vehicle log went through the dispatch office, and only he could fiddle the spreadsheet so the numbers tallied. The drugs were far more sinister. Expensive pharmaceuticals, strong opiates for end-of-life cancer patients, thrombolytics for heart attacks, reserve antibiotics, the sorts of drugs bought on massive NHS government contracts and accounted for individually were being smuggled out the back door. In their place, inside the paramedic grab bags, they placed ampoules from a semi-legal underground lab. The glass was real. The label looked almost perfect. The batch numbers were cloned. But inside was just saline, slightly tinted so it matched the visual profile of the real drug. They were written off as administered on scene, used on patients who died, on people who were no longer around to complain. The warehouse supply manager, a quiet bloke named Gary, who everyone at the station thought was just a boring pen pusher, ran that side of it. Arthur had been driving around with those ampoules for 18 months. He was the first to notice, not from the paperwork, but by eye. A new batch arrived, and the plastic slots in the box were just a fraction too wide. The cardboard felt slightly cheaper. Then patients started dying who, by every clinical metric, shouldn't have. Then Chloe's incident with the thrombolysis. He spent 8 months gathering proof, checking serial numbers, taking photos, copying delivery manifests. He got his hands on a photocopy of a genuine NHS delivery from April, so he had a baseline to compare against. On November 15th, he made an appointment with the Care Quality Commission inspectors and the regional police. The appointment was recorded in their system. He was due to drive down on the morning of the 16th. On the morning of the 16th, he got onto the A Road bypass and died 40 miles short of his destination. Somebody tipped them off that he'd made the appointment, Simon said, as he and Helen walked away from the Crown Prosecution Service offices toward the bus stop. Or he told someone himself. That's how it usually happens, love. People always want to ask for advice before they take the leap. Helen found out the name of the mastermind in the detective's office, and at first, she couldn't believe it. Dr. Archibald Vance, Chief Executive of the NHS Ambulance Trust, local borough councillor, into his 3rd term. The People's Doctor. That's what the local paper called him. He was always on the front page, either holding a shovel at a tree-planting ceremony, putting up tinsel at a local children's home, or posing in a white coat with a stethoscope around his neck, even though he hadn't used a stethoscope in 15 years. Helen remembered him. He had come to Arthur's funeral. He stood by the coffin, put a hand on her shoulder, and said that the trust had lost one of its most dedicated men, and that they would help her in any way they could. That help amounted to a £400 bereavement grant and a cheap floral wreath from the management team. He put his hand on my shoulder, she said aloud, speaking to no one in particular. The police raids took place on April 9th, a Wednesday. They found nothing in his office. Nothing in his detached house except presentation plaques and expensive single malt whiskey. But in a lock-up garage on an industrial estate on the edge of town, behind cheap plywood paneling installed to look like a DIY renovation, they found a hidden cavity spanning the entire wall. Inside was the second ledger, a thick, heavy-duty accounting book where everything was recorded accurately. How much real stock was stolen, how much went to the black market, to whom, and for what price. Next to it were 12 cardboard boxes of fake ampoules, waiting to be swapped into paramedic kits, and a smaller box containing a reel of counterfeit adhesive labels and a handheld stamping machine for the batch numbers, and an old rusty chest freezer, unplugged. Inside the freezer, in the vegetable crisper, were 3 thick brown envelopes stuffed with cash. Victor Price broke during his second police interview. He sat across from Helen, heavy, grey-faced, his chin sinking into his collar, the very man from the Mondeo's windscreen. At first, he tried to claim he was filming the hospital gates, because he was thinking of applying for a job there and wanted to see how busy the entrance was. Then he admitted Vance had asked him to just keep an eye on her to see if she was meeting anyone. Then he broke down crying and spilled everything. How they told him to find out who Arthur had booked a meeting with. How he rang and told them. How they paid him off later and told him to keep his mouth shut, that professionals would handle it and there would be no blowback. How he hadn't slept for 6 months. "I didn't know they were going to do that to him," he mumbled at the table. "They told me they were just going to scare him. I thought they'd just run him off the road." Helen stared at the top of his head and said nothing. D.I. Dawson cleared his throat once, just to make her sit up a little straighter. They managed to get a forensic engineering report done on the ambulance, even though the chassis had long been sent to the scrapyard. The front axle and steering rack had survived. They had been cut away and left sitting in a recovery yard because nobody had gotten round to melting them down. The specialist wrote his conclusion cautiously. "The nature of the sheer damage to the brake lines on the front offside wheel cannot be definitively attributed to the impact of the collision." Simon read the report 3 times and said, "That'll play well in front of a jury." The trial began at the Crown Court in late September and ran until February. Helen went to almost every hearing. At first, she sat in the public gallery at the very back. Later, the prosecutor asked her to sit closer to the front, as the victim's widow. Simon took days off work, put on a baggy suit that hung off him like a sack, and sat beside her. He spent every single hearing with a folded newspaper on his knees, never opening it once. Vance sat rigidly in the glass dock. He wore a neat jumper, his hair perfectly groomed, and spoke politely and in great detail as if chairing a board meeting. He explained that he knew nothing of the fraud, that the trust employed thousands of people, that he signed bulk supply manifests via a proxy signature, that he had sublet that lock-up garage 18 months ago to an acquaintance, and there were 3 sets of keys floating around. Once, he turned to the gallery, caught Helen's eye, and looked at her for a long time. There was no malice in his gaze, only annoyance. The way a man looks at a delayed train that has ruined his weekend plans. They let her give her victim impact statement in December. She stood up. Every word she had spent a month preparing completely vanished from her head. She looked at the judge, then turned and spoke directly to the glass dock. "My husband spent 20 years carrying people. He dragged them down 4 flights of stairs on spine boards. His back was shot by the time he was 40. Her voice trembled at first, then locked into something hard. When he picked up an ampoule of medicine, he trusted what was inside it. He believed in what he was doing. That's why he stopped sleeping those last few months. Not because he was frightened, but because he couldn't comprehend how something like this could even happen. He didn't tell me. He was protecting me. I resented him for it." She took a breath. "I don't know how many people died because you pumped them full of salt water, but I know of one old man who died in the back of an ambulance, completely unaware of why the drugs weren't easing the pain in his chest." She sat down. Somewhere in the gallery, someone blew their nose loudly. The verdicts were handed down on a Wednesday in February, at 11:30. 14 years in a Category B prison for Vance, stripped of his medical license and all pensions, with his assets seized. 11 years for Gary, the supply manager. 8 for Price, factoring in his early guilty plea and cooperation, with a legal caveat about being an accessory that Helen couldn't quite catch and had to ask Dawson to explain later. While the judge read the sentencing remarks, she stared at her hands resting on her handbag. Outside, sleet was falling, smearing diagonal grey lines across the high courtroom windows. She waited for something to happen, for the tension to break, or a floodgate to open, or just to find it easier to breathe. Nothing happened. They walked out onto the court steps. 2 men with a TV camera and a female reporter with a microphone were waiting at the bottom. The reporter stepped toward her. "Mrs. Gower, just a quick word for the local news. How do you feel today now that justice has been?" Simon stepped sideways in silence, placing himself perfectly between Helen and the camera, with the exact same unhurried, everyday movement he had used at the bus stop. "Sorry, love," he told the reporter. "She's got nothing to say to you. Come on, Helen." He took her by the arm and guided her down the steps, across the road, and into a small municipal park where the lime trees were bare and dirty snow was sliding off the grass onto the pavement. They walked in silence. Helen stared at her feet. 14 years, she said finally. "A long time," Simon agreed. "By today's standards, a very long time, but I feel absolutely nothing." The old man nodded, unsurprised. "And you won't feel anything," he said. "It's not the right medicine, love. All that does is make sure he won't be walking the streets or shaking anyone's hand for a decade. It doesn't fix a single thing for you." They reached the far end of the park, stopping by an empty, peeling bandstand. Helen stopped, and suddenly sat down heavily on the low brick wall, right in the freezing damp. not bothering to put anything under her. "I spent 6 months mentally yelling at him," she said. "I thought he was having an affair. I thought he'd fallen out of love with me because he'd sit up all night in the kitchen, and I'd just lie in bed listening to him." Simon stood over her. He didn't sit down. "Well," he said, "apologize to him. He'll understand. He was a smart bloke." Helen looked up at him, and for the first time that entire day, her face broke into something resembling a smile. Then she buried her face in her hands and sat like that for a couple of minutes. The old man stood beside her, turned toward the bandstand, inspecting the rusted iron railings as if trying to calculate what grit of sandpaper he'd need to prep them for a new coat of paint. Then, without turning around, he said, "Get up, your coat's soaking through, you'll catch your death. I've got some stew left over from yesterday. Come back to mine, you can warm it up." The phone call came in late March, just as Helen was hanging her washing on the clothes horse in the living room. "Helen Gower? This is St. Jude's Hospice. My name's Nina, the ward manager. Please don't panic. Nothing's wrong. I'm calling about something else entirely." Her voice was older, carrying that specific, measured bedside manner of someone who spends their life talking to people who are already going through hell. "We read about the trial in the local paper, and we got talking. We think there's something you ought to know. Could you come down and see us?" The hospice was located in a former Victorian primary school on the outskirts of town, a 2-story red brick building with a wide ramp and a faded green wooden canopy over the entrance. Inside, it didn't smell of bleach, but of something homely, like a roast dinner, and a tabby cat was wandering down the hallway. Nina met her at the reception desk and led her into a small staff room, where tomato seedlings were growing in plastic cups on the windowsill. "Take a seat." She opened a filing cabinet, pulled out a thick, hardback ledger, flicked through it, found the right page, and turned it toward Helen. "Here, November 8th. The page was divided into columns. The first was the date. The second listed the items, quantities, and batch numbers. The third listed the source, charitable donation, private individual, and in the final column was a signature. Helen recognized the handwriting before she even read the name. He always wrote his capital G with a long, sweeping tail, like a fishhook. "He turned up on a Saturday morning," Nina said, sitting opposite her. "In his own car, not the ambulance. Brought a cardboard box in, put it right down there on the floor. A big box, heavy. I said to him, 'Excuse me, mate, who are you? What charity are you with?' He said, 'I'm not with any charity. Check the batch numbers and the seals. It's all real. I bought it on the black market. The receipts are inside.'" Helen couldn't take her eyes off the ledger entry. "You have to understand," the ward manager continued, "we rely entirely on pain relief here. Our patients aren't getting better. Our only job is to make sure they don't die in agony. And that year, the NHS supply chain was an absolute disaster. Stock would run out, or they'd send us the wrong stuff. We had 9 patients in severe palliative care that week. 9. I've got them logged right here, showing the doses we used." "What else did he say?" "Anything?" He said, "Just don't tell anyone where it came from yet. When I get all this sorted out, you can stick my face on your notice board." Nina smiled sadly, her eyes watering. I asked him, "How on earth did you afford all this? This isn't 100 quid's worth of drugs. It's thousands." He laughed and said, "I had my old man's Triumph motorbike sitting in the lockup. I hadn't ridden it in 2 years. Sold that, and all my fishing gear." He said, "I don't mind. I was a rubbish fisherman anyway. I mostly just fell asleep on the riverbank." Helen sat perfectly upright. She remembered the empty fishing rod holdall in the loft she had pulled out and tossed aside without a second thought. She remembered asking him in October where the Triumph was, and him telling her he'd taken it to a mate's garage because the alternator needed a complete rebuild, and it was a slow job. She remembered how angry she had been. "We have no money, and he's messing about with a stupid rusty bike. He told me the bike was in the garage," she whispered. "Well, there you go," Nina said softly. They showed her the wards, though they didn't take her into the patient bays, just let her look through the doors. They showed her the staff photo board and the old curtains in the lounge they were raising money to replace. One of the palliative nurses, finding out who she was, came out and stood next to her for a while without saying anything, before finally whispering, "You know, we had a lady here then, Mrs. Higgins. She lived for another 9 days after he brought that box. On her very last day, the pain cleared enough that she recognized her granddaughter. That was entirely down to what he brought us." Helen took 2 buses to get home, staring out the window the whole way at the fields covered in patchy, melting snow. That evening, She got the old Twinings tea box out of the loft again. She laid everything out on the kitchen table. But this time, without the overwhelming terror she had felt the first time. She put the empty rod holdall in the corner. She picked up his NHS fleece jacket, dark green, with the ambulance crest on the breast and the reflective strips worn faint at the elbows from rubbing against the steering wheel smoothed it out, and held it for a long time. A week later, she took the fleece back to the hospice, not as a memorial, but for practical use. The groundskeeper there was working in a threadbare jumper, and the fleece was heavy-duty, with a thick thermal lining. "Are you sure?" Nina asked. "I'm sure," Helen said. "He'd be the first to tell you it shouldn't just be hanging in a wardrobe doing nothing." She kept the notepad. She put it in the chest of drawers where she kept her passport and marriage certificate, and never opened it again, but it was enough to know it was there. Helen started her return to practice nursing course in May. She had to travel to the university campus on the other side of the city, 3 days a week after finishing her night shifts. She sat in lecture theatres surrounded by girls who were 23, got out her notebook, and scribbled down everything the lecturer said like a school kid, because over the last 10 years, she had forgotten so much. She studied at home in the evenings, pacing around the kitchen, reciting anatomy out loud. Old Albert had passed away by then, and another elderly man was in his bed. Helen would catch herself mopping the floor while silently reciting the anaphylaxis algorithm in her head. She passed her NMC exams in July. Tara caught her in the corridor, grabbed her by the shoulders, and gave her a shake. "See, I told you. You wasted a year swinging a mop, but you're finally back where you belong." "I didn't waste it," Helen said. "I learned more about people doing that job than I did in my first 20 years of nursing." She got a job in A&E in August. On her first few shifts, her hands remembered the work slower than her brain did. She struggled with the new digital triage systems, couldn't immediately find where the cannulas were kept, and once completely missed a vein on a heavy-set man, which left her shaking for half an hour. But within a month, it all clicked back into place. By winter, she was working the triage desk on Friday nights, when the ambulances brought in every drunken casualty off the street. A young healthcare assistant named Kirsty, who had been put on shift with her, was terrified of blood and nearly quit on her first night. "Come here," Helen told her in the sluice room. "Look at me. Don't look at the blood, look at the patient. They are having a much worse day than you are. And when you pick up a mop bucket, use both hands, lift from the knees. You'll ruin your back before you're 30. Someone taught me that once. I've remembered it my whole life." Kirsty didn't quit. Simon's stroke happened in October, on a Monday, right at his security desk. The morning cleaner found him. He was slumped in his chair, his crossword resting in front of him, his biro rolled onto the floor. Helen found out 40 minutes later and sprinted across the hospital grounds, still in her scrubs. He was placed on the acute stroke ward. His left side was paralyzed, his speech was slurred, and he was angrier about that than anything else. "Don't you grunt at me," Helen would tell him, plumping his pillows. "The speech therapist is coming, and you're going to cooperate, and squeeze this rubber ball. Work those fingers. I bought it from the physio department." He muttered something back. She couldn't decipher the words, but from the tone, she knew perfectly well he had just told her to piss off. "Brilliant," she said. "If you're swearing, it means you're going to live." They discharged him 2 months later. He walked with a heavy walking stick. His left arm barely worked. His speech had mostly returned, though it tired and slurred by the evening. He had to quit his security job. His son drove up from Surrey, stayed for 4 days, took one look at Simon's ground floor flat with its steep bathtub and narrow hallway, and started bringing up brochures for a premium assisted living facility that offered full-time care. "He's not going to a care home," Helen said. "Well, where else can he go?" The son looked exhausted, polite, with his return train ticket already in his pocket. "He can't come to mine. I've got a wife, 2 kids in a 2-bed semi, and I travel for work 3 weeks out of the month. He's coming to mine." The son looked at her as if waiting for a punchline that never came. She reconfigured her flat, bought a tall IKEA wardrobe in the sales and used it as a room divider, hanging a heavy curtain where a door should be. She gave Simon the larger side with the window facing the estate, because staring out the window was going to take up a lot of his time now. She bought an armchair with a high back and sturdy armrests so he could push himself up, installed grab rails in the bathroom, and put down a non-slip mat. "Love, you're ruining your life," he told her on the first night, sitting on the edge of the sofa bed in the unfamiliar room, his stick resting between his knees. "You're still young. You need to be finding a husband, not emptying my commode." "You don't need a commode. You can walk to the toilet yourself." Helen smoothed out his duvet, refusing to turn around, And as for a husband, Simon, you're barking up the wrong tree. I got married once, and that was enough for a lifetime. Enough in a good way. It's still not right. It's not right, she agreed, fluffing his pillow. You walking me to the bus stop for a year wasn't exactly standard procedure either. Go to sleep. And that was how they lived. He turned out to be an infuriating lodger. He woke up at 6 a.m, shuffled down the hallway, turned the radio on in the kitchen, and provided running commentary on the BBC News. He grumbled at the television, at the soap operas, at the presenters, and at the weather forecast, which he insisted was entirely fabricated. He couldn't sit idle. Using his right hand and pinning things with his left elbow, he tightened the screws on every dining chair, oiled the hinges on the cupboards, and sharpened her kitchen knives to such a terrifying edge that she cut her fingers 3 times in the first week. Once a week, he made his beef stew. It took him hours, involving 2 separate stages of simmering, and he would bark orders at her from his armchair about when to add the carrots. He memorized her A&E shift pattern flawlessly, and whenever she dragged herself in from a night shift, he was already standing by the stove. By spring, the neighbours in the building had gotten used to him and greeted him as one of their own, old Mrs. Higgins from the ground floor would come up to get her blood pressure checked and end up sitting with him for an hour, drinking tea. Sundays were their sacred day. That particular Sunday in May, Helen got home from a shift at 9 a.m, slept until 2 p.m, and went into the kitchen. She was peeling potatoes, cutting the skin away in one long, continuous spiral, exactly how her mother had taught her. Simon was sitting on a stool by the window, hammering a loose wooden slat back into another chair, pinning it firmly between his knees. He choked up high on the hammer handle, because his left arm couldn't provide enough leverage for a full swing. You're holding that wrong, he said, not looking up. You're treating that paring knife like a razor blade. Half the potato is going into the compost bin. My mum taught me to do it like this. Your mum was a lovely woman, but she didn't know how to peel a spud. She laughed and didn't argue. Outside in the estate, someone was using a power saw. Kids were screaming in the playground. A breeze carrying the scent of lilacs from the front gardens drifted through the open window. The potatoes started sizzling in the roasting tin, and Helen snipped fresh rosemary directly over them with scissors before slamming the oven door shut. Steam plumed up toward the extractor fan. 2 frames hung on the wall next to the window. In one was a photo of Arthur, taken about 5 years before everything happened. He was in a t-shirt, standing by his car, squinting in the sun and laughing at something just out of frame. In the other was a certificate with an official crest, a letter of profound gratitude from St. Jude's Hospice, bearing his full name. Simon drove the last nail home, flipped the chair over, and leaned his weight on it to test it. Solid, he said with satisfaction. That'll outlive the both of us. They ate by the window. He told her a long story about the bloke in the flat downstairs who had bought a staffy and insisted on walking it at 5 a.m. He told it with heavy detail, repeating one part twice, because by late afternoon his speech started to falter. Helen listened and scooped more food onto his plate. Sit still, she said when he reached out to clear the plates. You've been banging a hammer all day, give it a rest. Stop trying to give orders. I'm the one in charge here. I'm a senior sister now, remember? He laughed his new, slightly lopsided laugh and pointed his fork at her. Ooh, you've gone ruthless, you have. She carried the plates to the sink, turned on the tap, and, standing with her back to him, spoke casually, as if still discussing the neighbor with the dog. Dad, is your neurology follow-up tomorrow at 9 or 10? Behind her, the kitchen went dead silent. Even the radio seemed to quiet down. Helen didn't turn around. She rinsed the first plate, slotted it into the dish rack, and picked up the second. 10, he said eventually, his voice thick. 10 o'clock, love. Then he coughed loudly. His stool scraped against the lino, and he retreated to his room. From behind the curtain, she could hear him blowing his nose into a handkerchief and muttering something about the dust from the sanding. That evening, she stepped out onto the small balcony. It was an ordinary northern estate. Swings, 3 cars parked half on the pavement, washing lines strung between posts, and a massive sycamore tree the council brutally pollarded every year that always grew back anyway. The sun had dipped behind the tower block opposite, turning the sky above the rooflines a bruised, purplish grey. Down below, someone started a car engine. It didn't catch immediately. The starter motor whined, then the engine fired up with a low grumble and puffed a small cloud of blue exhaust. Helen stood leaning on the metal railing. In the past, that sound used to make something tight and frantic flutter in her chest. She would rush to the window, peering out to see who it was, where they were going, and checking if the car was parked facing her building. She had done that for 18 months. Every single time, automatically. The way you check if you've left the iron on. Now, she heard the sound and stayed exactly where she was. The car pulled away, turned around by the commercial bins, and drove out of the estate. The noise faded around the corner. From inside the flat came a voice. "Helen, the telly says it's going to chuck it down tomorrow. They're lying, aren't they?" "They're lying," she called back through the half-open door. "Absolutely lying." She stayed on the balcony a little longer, watching the lights flick on in the block opposite one window, then 3 at once, then another on the top floor. Then she unpegged the dry towels from the line, hugged them to her chest, still warm from the sun, and walked back inside, where the TV was blaring, and the old man was already arguing with the weather forecaster.